Who were your parents?
Macy and Fay Holden. Macy and Fay Cox Holden. They lived at Clyde, and then they moved to Washington and lived in Zillah, Washington for several years. I don't really know how many. They had 4 children there. And then they come back here in 1936 and moved on part of the Cox property at a mile south of Clyde. Well, I went to school 11 and a half years at Cane Hill School. I went to Susanville, California for a half a year in the 5th grade. And the rest of the time I had Cane Hill. I thought we had a good school. I played on the basketball team. And we had a good basketball team. We always tried to beat Mara, of course. They wanted to beat us and we wanted to beat them. I rode a bus to school and had different bus drivers. I never did have to ride on a pickup like some of them did. We usually had a bus. And I can remember crossing Flat Rock when the water come up in the bus. It was that high.
Where's Flat Rock?
Down by the mill where you turn to go to Roy Jean's. It made a curve right there in the corner and went up right beside the Yates property.
Oh, yeah.
It was just a big flat rock that you drove across. And they had pictures. They had, I don't remember what they call the thing. You put a slide in it and you put it up to your eyes and looked at the animals and things. And we all liked to go back to the table and do that. And we had coloring books and things that we played at whenever we wasn't in class. Of course, there were several classes of us in each room. And when one class was having class, the others could do something else. Joanne Yates and Verna Pitts and me started school together and finished school together. Mary Patrick was a good friend. Mary Lee Grant was a good friend. Louise Biggs was a good friend. I had a lot of good friends. We was nearly a girl class. Very few boys we ever had in our class. We made stilts and we walked on them, and we had paddle boards. We'd take a tobacco can and nail it on a board and bend the sides up to run the wheels on. And we'd stomp oil cans and put our foot down in it, and they'd stick to our feet and we'd walk on them. Well, the first I remember, Shaker had a store across over in the old rock building by Mr. Russell's house. And he had feed and everything in there. And then he eventually built this building and moved over here. And then Ellis Jenkins come and bought it. And he had his store here. And then he converted the old bank building into the grocery store and moved over there. And then when we moved here, we had cows and raised some chickens. Daddy was one of the first ones that started growing broilers, a whole 500.
500.
And we kept the first one still. It was 23 weeks old as Dominickers. But we had to sell our own chickens. They were buyers. But you had to call them and tell them you thought your chickens was ready to come out and look at them. And they'd come out and tell you what they could give for them. We killed hogs. Daddy always had a bunch of hogs fattening to kill. And we had our own milk and butter. And they growed most of our food. They'd go to town on Saturday and take the cream off and the eggs and get whatever they needed, maybe a sack of flour or a sack of meal. And at one time I remember Daddy brought feed up and had it ground and made the flour. And I remember hearing my daddy tell about when he was a boy here, hauling stuff down there on a horse to have it ground. They had clubs, ladies did. And of course, the men would come here to the store and play dominoes and pitch and stuff. And a lot of people would gather at the store and visit. Roxy Digsmuke, she told us one time down here at the store, she said, "I've got hens up there." She lived up by the big spring. And she said, "I've got hens." And she said, "Nobody has never stolen any of my hens, and they never will." So that night, Joanne Yates and Mary Patrick and me decided we'd go get one of Roxy's hens. And we did. We got her around the neck where she couldn't squall. And we took her, Dorothy Pennell and Ernest lived where John lives up at Dwayne, I can't think of his last
Mitchell.
name. Yeah, where he lives. And we took that hen over there for her to help us cook because we didn't any of us know how to cook her. And we took her over there, and that was the toughest old hen. She pressured and pressured that hen for us to eat. But Roxy never did know we got her hen.
That's funny.
And we played hooky different times.
From school?
Yeah. One time there was several of us, all out of all grades in high school. And we all gathered here at the store. And we took off, of course we was afoot. And we went over by where Jim Lytle lived, up at the Booth Camel place, up that way to a big rock. And that the people was all talking about. And we was gone all day. And we come back out by Cold Springs. And when we got there, Miss Finley, our principal, was there waiting on us. And
Knew where you would be, huh?
I guess. And she drove us down the road like a herd of cattle. And we got to school, and she said, now you all cannot ride the bus. You've got to keep walking. So we just walked on, and come on down here to the store and caught the bus. Went home. I didn't want my daddy to know it.
Did he find out?
Very muchly. My brother was in on it too, but I didn't think he'd say as much to him as he did to me. But anyhow, I went up to the store with him at Clyde one day, and Wallace Yates was there, and he said, everybody called me Sis. And he said, Sis, what did your dad say when he found out about you playing hooky? And there stood Daddy. So he knew.
He'd have found out anyway.
Oh yeah, he'd eventually found out.
So did you get in trouble?
Not bad. Well, I can remember at one time years ago, the men would gather on Sunday afternoon and go rabbit hunting. There'd be several of them. And they'd come down to Daddy's a lot because we had a lot of woods around. And they'd go out through the pastures and the woods and hunting them. But they got a disease and they had to quit killing them. They was eating them, but after the disease got in them, they quit going. It must have been in about 47. I won't say that to be for sure. But we had a terrible ice storm here. And Alta Robson had the switchboard down here. And it tore all of the telephone lines out. The whole country back south was on her switchboard. And it broke the poles down, it took the lines down, it done everything. And I know here at the store, there was a lot of damage done, and over toward Connor Drossel's house, it was just the trees had all fell practically with ice on them. It was a terrible ice storm. And I remember that. We all come to see about it. And we was out of a phone for months. They had to rebuild them completely. When I was a teenager, they had dances across from Shaker's store over in the old building where he was upstairs. And it was a very narrow stairway going up there. And there was some windows that would open. And one night, Joanne and me, we'd kind of get around and go once in a while. The parents would let us go once in a while. And one night we was up there, and a couple of families, I'll not call the names, one of them, well, they was from the beer joint. They come and they was into it, and we knew both families, and they was fighting. And one of the families, we parked across from Shaker's store along, and you could park in front of Shaker's store too. And one of the families come across and got behind the cars on the opposite side of the store, and the others was on the store porch. And when Shaker would empty pop bottles, he'd set them out in cartons on the front porch. And they got to throwing them pop bottles at these other people and hitting them cars, and our car was down there. But evidently they missed it because we didn't have no broken windows. But we'd stand up there and watch them out the window, and we knew there was only one way for us to get out of there, and that was down that little narrow stairway. And we finally decided, after they kind of calmed down, we decided we was going to get out of there and go home before it started up again. So we did. And then come back another time, and I can't remember really who the people was that was really into it that night, but they got fighting upstairs. And we couldn't get out. And there was a fella from Lincoln, Roy J., and he got at the bottom of the stairs, and some of them was upstairs. And as they would push them down them stairs, he'd just knock them a-rolling. And he stopped the fight. And he got us all out of there safe, and we went home. That was the last time Joanne and me ever attended the dance. Bob Arts had them. He had a little store down below, and then he opened that up for a dance up there. And he had a little band up there. It was pretty nice, I guess, for a little country dance. But Joanne and me didn't get to go very often, but when we did, it seemed like something happened.